9-year-old Marcus Reed sat cross-legged on the carpet of his room, surrounded by model airplanes arranged in perfect formation. To Marcus, these weren't just toys. They were pieces of his future. Each tiny aircraft a promise that someday he'd soar high in the sky just like his dad, Captain Jordan Reed. The walls around him were covered in posters of planes, sleek fighter jets, sturdy cargo aircraft, and the latest commercial liners. He'd memorized every plane's specs, studied every poster's details, and dreamed of flying each one. Today was no ordinary day. Today, Marcus would be flying alone for the first time, heading across the country to visit his aunt. But what made this trip even more special was that his dad would be at the helm of the very plane he'd be flying on. It was as if all his dreams were aligning for a moment of pure, exhilarating magic. Reaching for his favorite model, a sleek jet with the same blue and white livery his father's airline used, Marcus carefully inspected it, turning it over in his hands. "You're coming with me," he whispered to the plane, wrapping it gently in a soft cloth before tucking it into his backpack. This wasn't just a flight to him, it was a mission, and every detail had to be right. The familiar sound of footsteps made him look up. Standing in the doorway, wearing his polished pilot's uniform with golden stripes on his shoulders and a small, proud smile, was Captain Jordan Reed himself. To Marcus, his father looked like a hero from one of the magazines they often read together. Someone who belonged in the sky, almost ready for takeoff. "Co-pilot?" Captain Reed asked, his deep voice carrying both warmth and authority. Marcus scrambled to his feet, mimicking his father's stance, trying to stand as tall and serious as possible. "Yes, sir. Just packing my lucky plane." His father's eyes softened, and he knelt down to Marcus's level, reaching out to adjust the junior pilot wings pinned on Marcus's jacket. "This is a big day, buddy," he said softly, pride shimmering in his gaze. "Your first solo flight." He paused, a trace of nostalgia in his voice. "I'm proud of you, son." Marcus felt his chest swell. There was no one he admired more than his dad. And to hear those words, it was like receiving his own wings. "Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down." Captain Reed placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his tone becoming serious. "Remember, no matter what happens, you keep your head up, all right? You're a part of this team, just like me." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words settle within him like the solid comfort of an aircraft's frame. "Yes, sir." As they made their way to the car, Marcus's heart raced with anticipation. The ride to the airport was filled with his rapid-fire questions, each one a window into the world he dreamed of joining. "Dad, what's it like up there in the clouds?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Captain Reed chuckled, a deep, warm sound that Marcus loved. "It's like the world is at your feet. The ground looks small, and you realize just how big the sky is. You're going to love it, son." When they reached the airport, Marcus's excitement grew tenfold. The grand terminals, the lines of planes parked outside, the hum of engines, it all felt like stepping into a world that was alive with the pulse of adventure. Captain Reed led him through the crowded terminal, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder with a quiet protectiveness. People nodded respectfully as they passed, acknowledging the captain's uniform and his presence, which made Marcus stand a little taller, feeling the pride of being by his father's side. At the security checkpoint, Captain Reed knelt down once more, his gaze steady and focused. "This is where I say goodbye for now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Do you remember everything we talked about?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. I'll stay in my seat, follow the flight attendant's instructions, and keep my seatbelt on." Captain Reed smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "Exactly. And remember, you're not alone on this flight. You're part of a team. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." With one last, tight hug, Captain Reed handed Marcus his boarding pass. "I'll see you on the other side, son." As his father disappeared down a separate hallway, Marcus took a deep breath. clutching the boarding pass in his hand. His heart thumped with a mix of excitement and nerves. He was ready to take on this journey alone, to prove that he could fly just as bravely as his dad. Stepping up to the gate, Marcus held his boarding pass out to the attendant, his eyes bright with anticipation. Today, he was more than just a passenger. He was a part of something bigger, part of the legacy his father had built. And he couldn't wait to take his first step into that world. Marcus gripped his boarding pass tightly as he approached the gate, practically vibrating with excitement. He could already picture himself settling into his seat by the window, eagerly waiting for the moment the plane would leave the ground, just like his dad had promised. This wasn't just any trip, it was his journey, his very first solo flight, and Marcus felt like he was on the edge of something extraordinary. The gate attendant took his pass, glancing briefly at him before calling over a flight attendant in a navy blue uniform. The woman approached with brisk, purposeful steps, her expression sharp and unreadable. She was tall and slender, with a pinched look to her mouth, like she was already tired of the day's demands. Marcus smiled at her, ready to introduce himself and explain his excitement, but she didn't seem to notice. "Unaccompanied minor?" she asked, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied politely, remembering his father's advice to always be respectful. He was determined to make his dad proud on this flight, especially in front of the crew. The woman glanced at her watch and barely looked at Marcus before handing him a small tag to clip to his backpack. "Stand over there," she instructed, gesturing toward a spot by the wall. Marcus swallowed, his smile fading slightly as he clipped the tag to his bag and took his place by the wall, waiting as instructed. This wasn't how he'd imagined it, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He was a part of this journey, a part of his father's world, and he wanted to make sure he did everything just right. As he stood there, watching other passengers pass by, he mustered up the courage to try again. "My dad's the pilot on this flight," he said, a hint of pride in his voice, hoping the mention of his father might spark some recognition or kindness. The flight attendant looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing with something like skepticism. "Look, young man, we don't do special treatment here. There's no need to make up stories," she said, her tone cold and dismissive. The words stung, sharper than Marcus had expected. His cheeks flushed, and he dropped his gaze, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and disappointment. He hadn't expected a grand response, but the bluntness in her tone felt unnecessary, harsh even. His father always spoke with warmth and respect, no matter who he was talking to. Why couldn't she? Silently, Marcus adjusted his backpack, trying to shake off the moment. His father's words echoed in his mind. "No matter what happens, keep your head up. You're part of this team." With renewed resolve, he lifted his chin and waited, choosing not to let her attitude spoil his first big adventure. Soon after, the boarding call came, and Marcus followed the line of passengers down the jet bridge. He clutched his backpack tightly, steadying himself as he stepped onto the plane's narrow aisle, eager to find a seat by the window. It was one of the things his father had arranged especially for him, knowing how much Marcus loved watching the wings during takeoff. The plane hummed with energy, passengers settling into their seats, stowing bags, and chatting softly. As Marcus finally spotted his assigned row, he moved forward, eyes bright with anticipation. But before he could take his seat, the same flight attendant, whose name tag read Claire Mitchell, appeared again, her eyes scanning the seat number. Her expression tightened as she noticed him standing there, as if he were somehow in the way. "Unaccompanied minors sit in the back," she stated flatly, gesturing to a cramped seat near the lavatory at the far end of the plane. "It's airline policy." Marcus's heart sank. He had been so excited to sit by the window, just like his father had arranged for him, and the view was something he'd looked forward to all week. But he didn't want to cause any trouble. He'd promised his dad he would follow the rules and do his best to handle things on his own. So he nodded, fighting back the disappointment, and gathered his things, trudging toward the back. When he reached the small seat by the lavatory, he carefully tucked his backpack under the seat in front of him, wedging himself into the narrow space. His window was tiny, offering only a partial view of the wing. Even the sounds were different here. The lavatory door opened and closed every few seconds with a sharp click, and voices from passing passengers filled the cramped space. It was nothing like he'd imagined. Stay positive, he reminded himself, clinging to his father's words. He was still on the plane, still on his journey, and most importantly, he was still part of his dad's team. He kept his chin up, fingers tracing the small junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket. They felt cool and reassuring beneath his touch. A reminder of the adventure he was on, even if it wasn't going quite as he'd expected. Just as he began to settle in, he heard a warm voice nearby. Looking up, he saw an elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes seated across the aisle, smiling at him. Quite the little traveler, aren't you? The man said, his voice friendly and gentle. Flying all on your own must be quite the adventure. Marcus's spirits lifted a little. Yes, sir. My dad's the pilot on this flight, he said with a small but proud smile. The man's eyes twinkled with warmth. Well, you must be very proud. Not everyone gets to fly with family. Marcus nodded, his excitement rekindling. I am, sir, he replied softly, the feeling of pride returning. Maybe, he thought, just maybe, this flight would turn out better than he expected. He took a deep breath, looking out at the bit of wing he could see from his window, and smiled to himself. No matter where he was seated, he was still part of the sky, part of the world his father loved so much. And that, he realized, was worth more than any seat by the window. Marcus settled himself into the narrow seat near the back of the plane, his backpack clutched close. He peered out the tiny window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wing, but his view was mostly blocked by the bustling galley. Every time the lavatory door opened and shut, the sound echoed sharply in the small space, making it hard for Marcus to find the calm he was used to when flying. It wasn't quite what he'd pictured when his dad had first told him about flying solo. Still, he reminded himself of his father's words. Keep your head up. This was his mission, his own adventure. And no matter what seat he was in, he was still on his way to the sky. As the plane began to fill with passengers, Marcus noticed a steady flow of people passing him, each caught up in their own journey. Some were flipping through magazines, others adjusting their headphones or chatting with seatmates. From time to time, a few passengers glanced his way, offering small, polite smiles. He returned each one, hoping to show he was just as polite and ready for the journey as his dad would have expected. Suddenly, Claire, the senior flight attendant, appeared in the aisle, pushing a cart loaded with drinks and snacks. As she served each row, her expression seemed to shift like clockwork. Polite smiles for some, a word of greeting for others. But when she reached Marcus's row, her face turned stony, her tone as flat as the cart's squeaky wheels. Would you like a drink? She asked, not bothering to look him in the eye. Yes, please, Marcus replied politely, hoping his voice sounded steady. May I have apple juice? Without a word, Claire poured the juice into a small plastic cup, setting it on his tray with a quick, careless thud. Some of the liquid splashed up the sides, and Marcus's smile faded just a bit. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet as he watched her move on without a backward glance. He glanced at the cup, noticing the small sticky trail left behind on the tray. But he said nothing, reminding himself again of his father's words. Across the aisle, an elderly woman watched the interaction with a frown, her gaze lingering on Claire as she walked away. She turned to Marcus, her eyes softening, and gave him a small, encouraging smile. For a moment, Marcus felt a little less alone. He took a sip of his juice, savoring the familiar sweetness, hoping it would bring some comfort. He was still on a plane. His dad was still the pilot. This was still his adventure. Marcus decided to take out his sketchbook, something that always brought him peace. Drawing airplanes was his favorite pastime, something he'd shared with his dad for as long as he could remember. He reached into his backpack, pulling out the sketchbook and a few neatly sharpened pencils, carefully arranging them on his tray. With a few light strokes, he began to trace the lines of the plane's wing as he imagined it. In his mind, the wings stretched far and sleek, cutting through clouds, his pencil gliding along the page in gentle arcs and curves. But as he focused on his drawing, a shadow fell over his tray. Claire had returned, her gaze fixed on the sketchbook and pencils with a look of disapproval. "This is an art class, young man," she said sharply. "Make sure you don't get pencil marks or shavings all over the seat. We have enough work without cleaning up after careless passengers." Marcus felt his cheeks flush, his fingers trembling slightly as he gathered up his pencils and tucked them back into his backpack. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He carefully closed his sketchbook, the excitement he'd felt moments before dimming to a quiet ache. He hadn't meant to cause any trouble. He'd only wanted to pass the time with something that reminded him of home, of his dad, of the many evenings they'd spent sketching planes together. Around him, a few passengers who had overheard the exchange glanced up, their expressions ranging from surprise to sympathy. One older man, seated nearby, shook his head slightly, casting a disapproving look at Claire's retreating figure. Marcus hugged his backpack a little closer, the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket, a small but steady reminder that he still belonged here. His father had chosen this flight for him. He was part of the team. No matter where he Saturday, no matter how he was treated. Still, the sadness lingered, settling in his chest like a low, uncomfortable weight. A few rows up, a young mother with a toddler on her lap turned to her husband, glancing back at Marcus. "Did you see how she spoke to that little boy?" she murmured, concern etched in her face. Her husband nodded, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, poor kid. He's just sitting there quietly, not bothering anyone." As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus felt the gentle hum of the engines, steady and comforting. He looked around, watching the other passengers as they relaxed into their seats. Some watching movies, others reading, a few even drifting off to sleep. He opened the seat pocket in front of him, pulling out a small set of in-flight activity sheets, hoping a little coloring or puzzle solving might lift his spirits. He was carefully tracing a cartoon airplane on one of the sheets when he felt a light tap on his shoulder. Looking up, he found Claire standing over him once again, her gaze sharp and critical. "You shouldn't be using a pen on the activity sheets," she said, her voice edged with irritation. "Crayons are less messy. If you get pen marks on the seat, it's very difficult to remove." Marcus lowered his gaze, setting the pen aside. "Yes, ma'am," he replied softly, his voice barely audible. He felt smaller and smaller with each word, as though he were slowly shrinking in his seat. After Claire left, the elderly man across the aisle leaned over, his eyes warm and understanding. "You doing all right there, young man?" he asked gently, offering Marcus a kind smile. Marcus looked up and nodded, but the sadness in his eyes must have been clear, because the man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Name's Harold, but my friends call me Mr. Lewis," the man said warmly. "You remind me of my grandson. He loves planes, too." Hearing that, Marcus felt a spark of joy break through his gloom. "My dad's the pilot on this plane," he replied, his voice filling with quiet pride. "One day, I want to be a pilot, too, just like him." Mr. Lewis's face softened, his eyes shining with admiration. "Well, now, that's something special. You know, sometimes people don't see us for who we really are, but that doesn't change who we are inside. You keep those wings close, young man, they mean something." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Mr. Lewis's words felt like a comforting balm, easing the loneliness that had crept into his heart. He took a deep breath, glancing down at the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket. They were more than just a badge. They were a reminder that he was part of something bigger. a team that stretched from the ground to the skies. Across the aisle, an elderly woman who had noticed the exchange leaned toward her seatmate, her face a mixture of kindness and indignation. "That boy has more grace in his little finger than that attendant does in her whole body," she whispered. And as Marcus sat there, watching the plane hum through the sky, he began to realize that even in this small, cramped seat, surrounded by strangers, he wasn't entirely alone. Kindness had a way of showing up in unexpected places.
And today,
It was the warmth of Mr. Lewis's words, the sympathetic glances of the passengers around him, and the quiet, reassuring hum of the engines. Marcus gazed out the small, cramped window, lost in his own thoughts. Despite his determination to stay positive, each dismissive look and sharp word from Claire chipped away at his confidence. He took a deep breath, keeping his fingers on the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket, a small piece of his dad he carried with him. His father had always told him that wearing those wings was a reminder of their family's pride, resilience,
and
most importantly, kindness. Across the aisle, Mr. Lewis watched Marcus with a gentle smile. The elderly man had been observing the boy for most of the flight, noticing not only the quiet sadness in his eyes but also the quiet strength in his posture. Finally, he leaned over, speaking softly.
"Hey,
"Young man," Mr. Lewis said, his voice warm. "Mind if I join you for a little chat?" Marcus looked up, and the hint of a smile flickered on his face. "No, sir. I'd like that," he replied, his voice soft but eager. Mr. Lewis leaned back, nodding as if he'd heard something he'd been waiting for. "You know, my grandson's around your age, and I can't help but see a bit of him in you. I can tell you've got a real love for flying." Marcus nodded, feeling the excitement spark back to life.
yes, sir."
"My dad's the pilot on this flight," he said, his voice filled with pride. "One day, I want to be a pilot too." Mr. Lewis's eyes sparkled with admiration.
"Well,
"Now that's a fine dream. Not everyone's got the courage to take on the skies."
but you."
"My friend, you're already on your way." As they spoke, a few other passengers took notice, quietly watching the exchange. A young mother with a toddler on her lap turned her head slightly, smiling as she listened. The businessman sitting a few rows up, who had been quietly observing, looked on with a mix of interest and sympathy. They'd all noticed how Claire seemed to single out Marcus, treating him with a coldness that seemed far too harsh for a young boy. And though none of them had spoken up directly, a silent understanding was beginning to form among them, a protective instinct toward the little boy who was simply trying to enjoy his first solo flight. Just then, Claire walked back down the aisle, her eyes flicking over Marcus as she passed. He sat up a bit straighter, hoping for a friendly glance or even a small nod of acknowledgement. But she moved on without a word, her expression as closed and indifferent as ever. He lowered his gaze, feeling a pang of disappointment. As she disappeared toward the front of the plane, the young mother leaned toward her husband, her voice a soft murmur. "Did you see that?" she asked, casting a concerned glance back at Marcus. "That poor boy is doing everything right, and she's treating him like he's nothing but a nuisance." Her husband nodded, frowning.
"Yeah,
"It's hard to watch, and he's been nothing but polite." The businessman overheard them, nodding in quiet agreement. "Seems to me she's got a chip on her shoulder for no good reason," he muttered, crossing his arms. The boy's only sitting there, not causing any trouble. Meanwhile, Mr. Lewis continued to chat with Marcus, filling the air with warmth and encouragement. "You know,
son," he said, his voice low and kind.
"sometimes people don't see us for who we really are, but that doesn't change the goodness inside of you. You hold on to that." Marcus nodded, his hand absently tracing the wings on his jacket. "Thank you,
"Sir."
I'll remember that." The conversation was like a balm, soothing away the rough edges of the morning. In Mr. Lewis's presence, Marcus felt seen, as though someone understood that he was more than just an unaccompanied kid in the back of the plane. He was a boy with dreams, a boy with a purpose, And Mr. Lewis saw that. As the plane settled into cruising altitude, Marcus pulled out his sketchbook again, deciding to give it another try.
Carefully.
He began to sketch the wing of the plane as he imagined it slicing through clouds. He lost himself in the gentle strokes of his pencil, the way the lines seemed to give life to his dream of flying. But moments later, Claire was back. She stopped in the aisle, her gaze sharp as it landed on Marcus's sketchbook and pencils. She pursed her lips, her expression hardening as she leaned down. "Didn't I tell you earlier?" she said, her voice low but scolding. "This is an art class. We don't want any mess here. Make sure you're not scratching up the tray." Marcus's face flushed, and his fingers trembled as he closed the sketchbook, carefully tucking it back into his bag. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he whispered, avoiding her gaze. From nearby rows, passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and silent disapproval. The young mother with the toddler shook her head, murmuring to her husband, "That boy's done nothing wrong, and she's acting like he's the one causing trouble." The businessman leaned forward, casting a meaningful look toward Mr. Lewis, who gave him a subtle nod, as if to say, "We're all noticing this." The silent alliance among them was beginning to take shape, an unspoken pact that they wouldn't let this treatment go unchallenged. As Claire moved back up the aisle, the elderly woman Marcus had helped with her seatbelt earlier leaned over to her seatmate, whispering with an indignant shake of her head, "That young boy showed more kindness in 2 minutes than that flight attendant has shown the entire flight," she said quietly. "It's shameful, really." Back in his seat, Marcus tried to shake off the sting of Claire's words, but the hurt lingered, heavy and difficult to ignore. He clutched his backpack, staring down at the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket, willing them to remind him of his father's pride and the strength he'd promised to carry. At that moment, Mr. Lewis reached across the aisle, his voice soft but full of encouragement. "You're handling this very well, young man," he said. "Remember, some people carry around things that make them see the world unfairly. But you keep being who you are, the right people will notice." Marcus looked up, meeting Mr. Lewis's warm gaze, and nodded, a flicker of strength returning to his eyes. Around them, the silent support of the other passengers felt almost like a shield, a steady presence that gave Marcus the courage to hold his head high. In the rows nearby, whispers of solidarity began to ripple quietly through the cabin. The young mother with the toddler, the businessman, the elderly woman, all of them exchanged looks of agreement, as though they were silently building a network of support for the young boy who had shown nothing but grace and respect in the face of Claire's unkindness. For the first time since boarding, Marcus felt a sense of belonging, a sense that he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. He looked out the small window, his heart steady, his mind filled with thoughts of the endless sky that awaited him, a sky that didn't judge or dismiss, but embraced those brave enough to dream. And as the plane cruised on through the clouds, he made a quiet promise to himself. No matter how others might treat him, he would hold on to the strength his father had taught him, because he was, after all, part of this team. The hum of the engines was like a steady heartbeat, thrumming through the cabin as the plane cruised above the clouds. Marcus leaned against his tiny window, staring out at the endless expanse of blue sky. He tried to ignore the sting of Claire's words and focused instead on the soft glow of sunlight bouncing off the clouds below. Somewhere far ahead, in the cockpit, his father was flying this very plane, guiding it safely through the open sky. That thought brought him a sense of calm, anchoring him in a place of hope. The quiet hum was broken by the sound of soft footsteps making their way down the aisle. It was Sarah Thompson, the co-pilot. Unlike the other flight attendants, Sarah often took a stroll through the cabin during longer flights, enjoying the chance to connect with passengers. She scanned the rows, smiling here and there, her gaze warm and attentive. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused, noting the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket and the small model plane he'd taken out of his backpack.
"Well,
"Hello there, co-pilot," she said with a friendly grin. crouching down so she was eye level with Marcus. "I see you've got some pretty impressive wings yourself." Marcus looked up, his face lighting up with excitement. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied proudly. "My dad gave them to me. He's the pilot on this plane." Sarah's eyes sparkled with interest, and she nodded approvingly.
Now,
"That's something special, isn't it? You know, it's not every day a future pilot gets to ride in the cabin with his dad up front. That makes you part of the team." Marcus's chest swelled with pride at her words. "One day, I want to be just like him," he said, his voice filled with the quiet determination that had carried him through the flight so far. Sarah's smile grew, a touch of admiration in her gaze. "With the heart you've got, I'd say you're well on your way. It takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing, flying all by yourself. Staying strong. Not everyone could handle it the way you are." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her kindness wrapping around him like a protective cloak. For the first time since he'd boarded the plane, Marcus felt a sense of relief. Sarah's words, her kindness, they felt like an invitation back into the world he loved. The world his dad had shown him. He was still part of the team. And that reminder was more powerful than any cold glance or sharp word. Just then, Claire's voice rang out from farther up the aisle.
Sarah.
"We need you in the cockpit," she called, her tone brisk. Sarah glanced up, catching a hint of irritation in Claire's expression. She gave Marcus a quick wink before she stood, a quiet promise of support in her eyes. "Hang in there, co-pilot," she said softly, giving his shoulder a final pat. "And remember, you're not alone." As Sarah made her way back up the aisle, Marcus watched her go, her presence leaving a comforting warmth in its wake.
Nearby,
a few passengers who had witnessed the exchange smiled, nodding subtly to one another. The young mother with the toddler shared a glance with her husband, her expression softening as she watched Marcus. She leaned close to her husband, whispering, "It's nice to see someone recognize how special this is for him." The elderly woman across the aisle caught Mr. Lewis's eye, nodding approvingly. "That boy's got a good heart," she murmured. "And that co-pilot, she can see it." As Marcus settled back into his seat, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just an unaccompanied minor sitting in the back of the plane. He was part of something bigger. His father had taught him that being a pilot wasn't just about flying. It was about looking out for others, showing respect, and staying strong, no matter what. With that thought in mind, he turned his attention back to the model plane in his lap, carefully tracing the edges of its wings. He could almost picture himself in the cockpit, soaring above the clouds, guiding passengers safely to their destinations. One day, he thought, he would get there. A few rows up, Claire watched Sarah's interaction with Marcus from a distance, her face unreadable. When she noticed Marcus holding the model plane with such care, something seemed to flicker in her expression, a brief shadow of something unspoken. But just as quickly, it vanished, and her usual brisk demeanor returned as she moved on with her duties. Around Marcus, the other passengers had noticed the dynamic shift in the cabin. There was a quiet energy, a subtle sense of solidarity among them. The businessman in the row ahead leaned over to Mr. Lewis, speaking in a low voice. "Did I hear correctly?" he asked, glancing toward Marcus. "Is that boy really the son of the pilot?" Mr. Lewis nodded, his eyes gleaming with pride.
Yes, he is.
"And he's been nothing but respectful. You'd think he'd be treated a little better, considering." The businessman's brow furrowed, his expression darkening slightly.
"Well,
it's clear she doesn't know who he is, or she just doesn't care. Either way, it's no way to treat anyone, let alone a kid." The murmurs continued to spread, a low hum of agreement that threaded quietly through the cabin. One by one, passengers shared glances, nodding silently to one another, as if forming an unspoken alliance. They'd all witnessed the way Marcus had been treated, and something about it didn't sit right with them. It wasn't just about following airline policies or enforcing rules. It was about basic respect, something Marcus had shown to everyone he'd encountered. despite the way he'd been treated. As the plane sailed on, Marcus felt the gentle support of the passengers around him. He sensed their kindness, even in the smallest gestures, the nods, the sympathetic smiles, the subtle glances. They might have been strangers, but in that moment, they felt like allies, people who understood what it meant to stand up for what was right. From the front of the cabin, Sarah reappeared, casting a quick, reassuring look in Marcus's direction. He met her gaze, feeling the strength of her silent encouragement, and nodded in return. She was on his side, and that gave him the strength to face whatever came next. In that moment, Marcus knew that he wasn't just flying from one place to another, he was part of something much bigger. A world that valued respect, kindness, and courage. And in the quiet solidarity of the passengers around him, he felt the strength to keep holding his head high,
just like his dad had taught him.
The cabin lights dimmed as the plane continued its journey above the clouds, and Marcus stared out his small window, watching the pale sunlight filter through the thin clouds below. Somewhere up ahead, his father was guiding the plane, and that thought kept Marcus grounded. Even as he tried to ignore the sting of Claire's coldness, he gently touched the junior pilot wings on his jacket, his father's voice echoing in his mind. "You're part of this team, just like me." But the further the flight went on, the harder it was to keep his head up. Every time Claire passed, her gaze flicked over him with a look that seemed to say, "You don't belong." He clung to his father's words, determined not to let her treatment dim the pride he felt in being here, on this plane, flying with his dad.
Just then,
Claire reappeared, her cart rattling softly as she made her way down the aisle. She wore a polite smile as she served drinks to each row, exchanging pleasant words with the passengers. But when she reached Marcus's row, her smile faded. Her tone turned brisk and impersonal, as if he were nothing more than another task to complete. "Would you like a drink?" she asked, barely glancing his way.
"Yes."
"Please," Marcus said politely, his voice small but steady. "Could I have apple juice?" Without a word, Claire poured the juice and set it down on his tray with a quick thud. Some of the juice splashed over the sides, but she didn't notice, or didn't care. Marcus thanked her softly, trying to stay positive, though his shoulders drooped slightly as he took a sip. This time, the sting felt sharper, and he could feel the weight of the entire flight pressing down on him. Nearby, Mr. Lewis watched the interaction with a deepening frown, his jaw set. The elderly man had seen enough. Clearing his throat, he raised his hand, signaling to Claire as she turned to move on. "Excuse me, Miss Mitchell," he called, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment, if you don't mind." Claire turned, looking slightly impatient. "Yes? Can I help you with something?" she asked. Her tone clipped. Mr. Lewis's eyes were steady, filled with quiet determination. "I couldn't help but notice how you've been speaking to that young boy over there," he said, nodding toward Marcus, who was staring down at his juice, trying not to draw attention. "It seems you're going out of your way to enforce rules that don't quite apply." Claire's expression tightened, her posture growing defensive. "I'm simply doing my job,
sir.
All passengers must follow the same rules." From a few rows up, the businessman who had been quietly observing leaned forward, his face reflecting his disapproval. "I fly frequently, and I can't say I've ever seen a child treated quite this way," he added, his tone controlled but firm. "Especially not one who mentioned his father is the pilot of this plane." Claire's eyes narrowed briefly, though she quickly masked it. She glanced around, noticing that more and more passengers were watching. Her posture stiffened as she addressed them, her voice hard. "Regardless of who his father is, I am responsible for ensuring order and compliance on this flight." But her words didn't seem to have the same authority they had before. One by one, passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of agreement and silent resolve. The young mother with the toddler nodded firmly, her gaze filled with quiet determination. "There's no need to single out a child like that," she said softly, looking toward Marcus with compassion. He's done nothing but sit quietly. Around her, other passengers murmured in agreement, their voices blending into a soft wave of support that filled the cabin. Claire seemed momentarily at a loss. Caught off guard by the passengers' unexpected unity, she glanced around, her expression guarded as she took in the collective gaze of the cabin. At that moment,
Sarah,
the co-pilot, made her way back into the aisle. Alerted by the unusual tension, she noticed the cluster of passengers, their quiet disapproval radiating through the cabin, and approached the group, her gaze calm and steady. "Is everything all right here?" Sarah asked, her tone even, though her eyes held a subtle look of understanding. Claire straightened, clearly feeling the weight of the passengers' attention. "I'm just following protocol," she replied quickly. "Some passengers seem to have concerns about our policies." Sarah's gaze drifted over the passengers, taking in the quiet solidarity reflected in their expressions. Before settling on Marcus, she knelt beside him, her voice soft and warm. "How's it going, co-pilot?" she asked gently. Meeting his gaze with an encouraging smile, Marcus looked up, relief flickering in his eyes. It's okay, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady but small. Sarah nodded, her smile widening. "You know, I hear you're quite the aviation enthusiast. Is that a model of this plane you've got there?" Marcus nodded, holding up the small model with pride.
Yes, ma'am.
"My dad gave it to me." Sarah's eyes softened,
And she reached out.
giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze.
Well,
"That's pretty special. Not everyone gets to bring a piece of the skies with them." She glanced at Claire, her expression turning firm.
Claire.
"Could we have a quick word in the galley?" Claire hesitated, glancing at the passengers watching her, then nodded. "Of course," she said stiffly. Without another word, she turned and followed Sarah to the back of the plane, her expression strained. As they disappeared into the galley, the passengers relaxed slightly, sharing small nods of approval. Mr. Lewis leaned across the aisle, giving Marcus a reassuring smile. "Don't you worry, young man. You're doing just fine," he said gently. "Not everyone sees the world the way we do, but that doesn't change who you are." Marcus nodded, a flicker of strength returning to his eyes. Around him, the silent alliance among the passengers grew stronger, their expressions a quiet but powerful show of support. In the galley, Sarah crossed her arms, her voice low but firm as she addressed Claire. "I've flown with you plenty of times, and I've never seen you act this way. What's going on?" Claire looked away, her jaw clenched. "I'm just following policy. Unaccompanied minors need structure. There's structure, and then there's going too far." Sarah replied, her tone laced with disappointment. "That boy is just trying to enjoy his flight. His father is one of our best pilots, and he's following in his footsteps. He deserves the same respect we'd show anyone." For a moment, Claire's face softened, a flicker of something vulnerable breaking through her rigid expression. "It's just these kids. They come on the plane, and they think they can do whatever they want." Sarah shook her head slowly. "That boy has done nothing wrong, and if you took a moment to actually see him, you'd realize that kindness doesn't cost a thing." "Claire." Claire's shoulders slumped, a knot of regret settling in her chest. She glanced down the aisle, where she could see the passengers watching her with quiet disapproval. A heaviness filled her heart as she remembered the excitement she once felt for her job, a time when she'd cherished each connection she made. Somewhere along the way, that spark had faded, leaving her with little but rules and policies to cling to.
Taking a deep breath,
Claire looked back at Sarah, her voice quiet. Maybe I owe him an apology." Sarah's expression softened. "It's never too late to make things right." With hesitant steps, Claire made her way down the aisle toward Marcus, the passengers watching her closely. She stopped beside his row, her gaze meeting his. The hardness in her eyes had softened, replaced by a hint of remorse. "Marcus," she began, her voice unsteady, "I owe you an apology. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve." And I'm truly sorry. Marcus looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. He hesitated, then nodded, his voice soft. Thank you, ma'am. Around them, the passengers exchanged approving looks, a quiet sense of relief and resolution filling the cabin. Mr. Lewis gave Marcus a small nod of encouragement, while Sarah watched from the galley, satisfaction in her gaze. The cabin settled, the tension easing as the plane continued its steady journey through the clouds. And as Marcus looked out his small window, a sense of peace washed over him. He had held his head high, just as his father had taught him. And the passengers who had stood with him were more than just strangers now. They were allies, friends, people who believed in kindness, respect, and courage, no matter where they found themselves. The plane began its descent, the soft hum of the engines shifting as the cabin lights brightened. Marcus felt the change in altitude, but this time, instead of nerves or isolation, he felt a steady warmth, a sense of belonging. As he sat by the small window, he could sense the quiet support from the passengers around him, their smiles,
Nods.
and whispers creating a silent but powerful wave of reassurance. Claire moved down the aisle, checking on passengers. Her expression noticeably softened. Each time she passed Marcus, he felt her gaze linger, and though he still felt the remnants of the hurt she'd caused, he could see something different in her eyes, something close to regret. When she reached his row, she paused, taking a deep breath before speaking. Marcus, she began, her voice soft but clear. I wanted to say thank you, not just for your patience, but for showing such kindness throughout this flight. I'm sorry for the way I treated you earlier. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that, and I hope you can forgive me.
Surprised.
Marcus looked up at her, the sincerity in her expression catching him off guard. He hesitated, but then his father's words echoed in his mind. Always show respect, son, even when it's not returned. Taking a breath, he met her gaze and nodded. Thank you, ma'am, he said, his voice quiet but steady. I forgive you. Around them, the passengers who had witnessed the earlier tension shared approving glances. The young mother, with the toddler mouthing, Well done, to Marcus. Mr. Lewis gave him a small nod, his eyes filled with quiet pride. And the businessman, seated a few rows up, looked on with a satisfied smile. As Claire continued down the aisle, Marcus felt a sense of relief settle over him, as if the weight of the entire journey had lifted. He glanced at Mr. Lewis, who leaned over, his voice gentle. You handled that like a true gentleman. Young man, he said, his gaze steady. Sometimes, forgiveness is the hardest strength of all. Marcus smiled, his heart filling with warmth. He knew his father would be proud, not just of the way he'd conducted himself, but of the quiet strength he'd found within himself. The plane continued its descent, the clouds breaking apart to reveal the landscape below, and Marcus felt a sense of anticipation building within him.
Soon,
he'd be reunited with his dad, and he couldn't wait to tell him everything that had happened, the challenges, the kindness of strangers, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. Beside him, Mr. Lewis offered a reassuring pat on his shoulder. Almost there, young man. Soon you'll be able to tell your father all about your journey. Marcus grinned, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. Thank you,
sir,
for everything. The businessman leaned over from a few rows up, joining the conversation. You've got quite the spirit,
kid, he said,
tipping an imaginary hat. And you're lucky to have a dad who's taught you so much. Marcus's chest swelled with pride as he looked down at the junior pilot wings pinned to his jacket. He'd been tested in ways he hadn't expected, but with the support of the passengers around him, he'd found the strength to hold his head high. As the wheels touched down smoothly on the runway, the cabin filled with the familiar clicks of seat belts releasing, the low hum of passengers rising and gathering their belongings. Marcus remained seated, savoring the moment, the quiet knowledge that he had made it through with grace and courage. One by one, the passengers disembarked, but many lingered just long enough to offer him a smile, a wave, or a nod of encouragement. The young mother with her toddlers smiled warmly as she passed. "You did great," she whispered, giving him a thumbs up. The businessman paused to give him a respectful nod. "Take care, young man. And remember, keep chasing those dreams." Mr. Lewis was one of the last to leave, offering Marcus a warm handshake. "You're well on your way,
"Son," he said.
his voice filled with pride. "Keep those wings close. And don't ever lose that kindness of yours." "Thank you, Mr. Lewis," Marcus replied, his voice filled with gratitude. As Marcus finally rose, securing his backpack on his shoulders, he felt a mixture of pride and relief. He stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, his heart racing with excitement. He scanned the crowd, and there, standing tall in his crisp uniform, his face lighting up the moment he spotted Marcus, was his father, Captain Jordan Reed. "There's my boy," Captain Reed called. Kneeling down with open arms, Marcus broke into a grin, running into his father's embrace, feeling the strength and warmth he'd missed. For a moment, he buried his face in his father's uniform, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and fresh air, a comforting reminder of home. Captain Reed pulled back slightly, looking into his son's eyes with pride. "How was the flight, buddy?" he asked gently, sensing there was more to the story than Marcus had told him. Marcus hesitated, glancing back toward the gate, his mind filled with memories of Claire's treatment, the kindness of the passengers, and the support he'd found in unexpected places. Finally, he looked back up at his dad, a hint of pride in his voice. "It was different," he admitted honestly, "but I made some friends, and I learned a lot." Captain Reed's smile grew, understanding immediately. "Sounds like you handled it just fine." He straightened, resting a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You know, I've got a little time before my next flight. How about I introduce you to a few people in the cockpit?" Marcus's eyes widened with excitement, his fatigue vanishing instantly. "Really?" he asked, his voice brimming with anticipation. "Really?" Captain Reed chuckled, leading him toward the cockpit. As they walked, Marcus's heart swelled with pride, knowing that, even in a small seat at the back of the plane, he'd carried himself with the same strength and kindness his father had always shown him. The gentle hum of the airport surrounded them as Captain Reed led Marcus through the terminal, his hand resting firmly on his son's shoulder. Marcus felt a sense of relief, a feeling that the weight of the journey was finally settling into something he could carry proudly. But more than that, he felt a new kind of confidence, a quiet strength that he knew he'd earned. Captain Reed guided Marcus through a special entrance, leading him into the cockpit. The space felt like magic itself, filled with rows of switches, dials, and screens that blinked and glowed in soft, steady pulses. Marcus's eyes widened as he took it all in, the heart of the plane his father had commanded with calm authority. In this small space, everything he loved about flying seemed to come alive. "These are your primary flight controls," Captain Reed explained, his tone patient and filled with pride. "They keep us balanced in the sky, helping us guide the plane safely from one place to another." He gestured to a specific gauge, his voice calm and steady. "And over here, this one tells us how high we're flying." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes filled with wonder as he traced the layout of the controls with his gaze, imprinting every detail in his mind. He looked over at his father, admiration shining in his expression. "Dad," he breathed, "this is incredible. It's like the whole world is right here." Captain Reed smiled, his own eyes softening. "You're right. But being a pilot isn't just about flying the plane, Marcus. It's about taking care of everyone on board, making sure they feel safe, respected, and valued. Sometimes that means standing up for yourself, and sometimes it means standing up for others." Marcus listened, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He thought back to Mr. Lewis, to Sarah, to the passengers who had offered him kindness and support even when things felt hard. The quiet strength they'd given him had helped him get through each moment, reminding him that he wasn't alone. He glanced out of the cockpit window at the vast blue skies stretching beyond them, feeling a sense of peace that he couldn't quite explain. "Like how Mr. Lewis and everyone else on the plane stood up for me," he said softly, a hint of pride in his voice. Captain Reed nodded, his smile warm and filled with pride.
Exactly. You see,
Being part of a team, whether it's in the cockpit or in the cabin, means we're all there for each other, no matter what. He placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder, his expression serious. "And you, my son, showed you're ready for that responsibility. You handled yourself with respect and courage. That's something not everyone can do." For a long moment, father and son sat in the cockpit, the silence between them filled with understanding and mutual respect. Marcus looked out at the horizon, the skies stretching endlessly before him, a reminder of the dreams he'd held close since he was little. One day, he thought, he would be here, guiding planes through the skies, carrying on his father's legacy with the same strength and dignity he'd shown today. As they left the cockpit, they passed back through the terminal, where a few familiar faces had lingered to say goodbye. Mr. Lewis was there, his face lighting up as he spotted Marcus.
well,
"If it isn't my young pilot friend," he greeted warmly, extending his hand for a handshake. "How was the tour?" Marcus grinned, looking up at his father before turning back to Mr. Lewis. "It was amazing. My dad showed me everything." Mr. Lewis chuckled, patting Marcus on the shoulder. "You're well on your way, young man. Keep those dreams close and keep flying high." As they spoke, the elderly woman whom Marcus had helped during the flight approached, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you again for your kindness,
dear," she said softly.
it meant the world to me." Marcus smiled shyly, nodding. "It was my pleasure, ma'am."
Just then,
Claire emerged from the gate, her expression a mixture of regret and humility. She took a deep breath, meeting Captain Reed's gaze before shifting her attention to Marcus. "Captain Reed." "Marcus," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "I wanted to say again that I'm sorry for the way I acted. Sometimes, we forget the impact our actions can have." She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze earnest. "I didn't treat you fairly, and I'm truly sorry." Captain Reed looked down at Marcus, a small nod of approval in his gaze, before he turned back to Claire. "Thank you for your apology, Claire," he said simply. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." Marcus nodded, offering her a small smile. "Thank you,
ma'am."
I understand, and I forgive you." Claire's face softened, a hint of gratitude shining in her expression. "Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot." As Marcus and his father walked toward the exit, he glanced back one last time, taking in the sight of the terminal, now filled with strangers who felt more like friends. This place, once just a passageway to somewhere else, had become something more, a place where he'd found courage, kindness, and a sense of belonging. "Dad," Marcus said as they stepped out into the bright sunlight, the vast blue skies stretching endlessly above them. "Do you think I'll be a pilot one day?" Captain Reed smiled, his gaze filled with unwavering belief. "I know you will, Marcus. You've already shown you've got what it takes." And as they walked forward, Marcus felt the weight of his journey settle into something powerful, something he'd carry with him always. Today hadn't just been a flight, it had been a reminder of who he was and who he could be. With every step, he felt his dreams draw closer, like the clear skies stretching out before him, a reminder that his future was waiting, ready for him to soar.